Hello, welcome to Living Room Talk, some thoughts and issues and events that you might be thinking about too. My name is John Graham, adventure activist, former diplomat. More on me in a memoir, Sit Down Young Stranger, on Amazon and at johngraham.org. Today I want to talk about Ukraine. I think Putin's bluffing, and that he thinks he can get what he wants without fighting. Hell yes, it's scary. 125,000 Russian troops are poised on the border with Ukraine. The U.S. has put 8,500 soldiers on high alert. NATO is sending ships and guns to the region, as well as shipments of arms to the Ukrainian forces. After years as a NATO war planner, I can tell you that one miscalculation by either side could mean a face-off between nuclear-armed opponents. But this is no Cuban Missile Crisis, at least not yet. Putin's too smart to deliberately launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine with all of its risks and costs, not when he's convinced that he can get what he wants without fighting. Putin's aims are political, and he intends to achieve them through a clever playing of his cards, with military threats his ace. Most immediately, Putin wants greater Russian control over Ukraine, a country he sees as part of Russia, culturally, historically, and a place with enormous strategic importance, as part of the land buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe. And he knows that a Ukraine that faced down Russian threats could be a model for other vassal states like Kazakhstan, where Russian troops were crushing protests last week, by the way, just to see how hard they can poke the bear. But Putin aims go beyond regional fights. The man's determined to correct what he's long viewed as a major catastrophe of the 20th century, the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, leaving what is to him an embarrassingly dim shadow of a once great empire. Ultimately, Putin wants to turn the clock back 30 years to the days when the Soviet Union was a superpower and NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets and their client states, faced each other as equal powers across the Iron Curtain. Getting Russia back to that level of influence means not just blocking NATO expansion into Ukraine and drawing Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit, it also means kicking NATO out of all of Eastern Europe. Putin has seethed with every move by the United States and NATO to push the boundaries of NATO eastward, following the collapse of the USSR. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined the alliance in 1999. A dozen other states in Eastern Europe quickly followed, creating what Putin and most Russians regarded as an existential threat, literally on their doorstep. He's got a point. If Russia established bases and alliances from one end of the Caribbean to the other, the U.S. would certainly feel threatened. But American war hawks, flushed with victory in the Cold War, have consistently and foolishly ignored this reality. With their major adversary dramatically weakened, the hawks went for the jugular, ignoring that Russia would inevitably regain her footing and fight back, destabilizing the region anew and installing tough new nationalist leaders like Vladimir Putin, who quickly learned to use Russian anti-West fears and resentments as a springboard for personal power. 2008, NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would be invited to join the alliance too. So that was a bridge too far, and provoked such a furious backlash from Russia that NATO backpedaled, postponing plans for additional memberships. But in 2014, Ukraine sought an association with the European Union, thinking that might be a safer route than NATO membership. Moscow saw this move as a backdoor into NATO and reacted, annexing Crimea and backing a rebellion by eastern Ukrainians, many of whom wanted to be part of Russia. When the West's only reaction to these aggressive moves was modest economic sanctions, Putin saw what he thought was a paper tiger. And now he's decided the time is right to risk much bolder moves, using Ukraine as a pretext for throwing NATO out of Eastern Europe altogether. Why not? Nobody's stopped him yet. But why now? Putin sees the United States as seriously polarized, weakened at home, and in retreat abroad. So he's encouraged to keep raising his bets, hoping to use verbal threats and a massive military buildup to bluff his NATO opponents out of the game. But NATO is starting to push back with a unity and determination that I don't think Putin expected. Diplomatic talks to end the crisis have so far been fruitless. Russia wants ironclad guarantees that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO and that NATO will pull back from advanced positions in Eastern Europe, and that America will draw its forces and weapons from Europe, including its nuclear missiles. Fat chance. The U.S. has made clear its determination to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the right of all nations to choose their own security arrangements and alliances. And the U.S. has no intention of removing its troops and missiles from Europe. The pressures on the Biden administration are intense. How the U.S. handles Russia over Ukraine affects its ongoing efforts at rebuilding ties with NATO allies after the shredding they endured by Donald Trump. More broadly, an intensifying conflict in Ukraine tests the resolve of the Biden administration to restore international confidence in America's global leadership, following Trump's isolationist efforts to end it. A NATO failure to foil Putin's aggressive moves in Ukraine would establish Russia as a dominant expansionist power in Eastern Europe and set a precedent for future action by other countries. It would encourage Taiwan, for example, it would encourage China to increase its threats against Taiwan. And regimes in Iran and Syria would conclude they are freer to use violence with impunity. There are intense pressures on Putin as well. The weapons NATO has sent to the Ukrainian armed forces will exact a heavy price on Russian invaders, just as Stinger missiles supplied to the Mujahideen crippled the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan. Should an invasion succeed, Russian forces would face ongoing losses to the citizen militias that are already preparing for a drawn-out guerrilla campaign against Russian occupiers. Russia would not only suffer casualties, especially during a long-running insurgency, but causing the death of untold Ukrainians, fellow Slavs with whom many Russians have family ties, would not go well back home. Putin's already discounted additional U.S. financial sanctions. He assumes that some NATO allies will be reluctant to follow suit on sanctions, and many other countries with important trade relationships with Russia will look the other way. Some of that would certainly happen, but the next round of sanctions, even if not applied universally, will be significantly harsher than those Russia has endured so far. Russian banks would be severely penalized and its economy and military deprived of crucial American high-tech components. The ultra-rich would find it far harder to spend and save abroad. Ordinary Russians would suffer from lower living standards and soon miss their beloved next-generation phones, laptops, and other gadgets. Cutting Russia off from the international banking system would cripple the use of credit cards. Oof, ouch. Russia could retaliate by cutting off the flow of natural gas to Europe, but the Biden administration is already working with gas and crude oil suppliers from the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia to bolster supplies to Europe in the coming weeks. Russia could step up its cyber warfare efforts against the West, but this time the West is prepared to respond in kind. Finally, Russian aggression in Ukraine has already created a unity and energy in NATO that the alliance hasn't enjoyed for years, and it's forcing a shift of U.S. attention from China back to its traditional role in security cooperation with Europe. Not perhaps what Putin had in mind. What to do right now? Even if a full-scale invasion is not likely, the U.S. and NATO need to confound Putin's intention to lock them into an endless tactical game while he takes more chunks out of Ukraine and bullies other vassal states formerly part of the USSR. The West needs to continue with carefully graduated military and economic responses of its own. If Putin tries to make his bluff more credible, for example by invading areas of eastern Ukraine where Russia is already in de facto control, then NATO's answer must be swift, proportionate, and painful. Diplomats should keep talking, looking for common ground on arms control, and pressing for face-saving clangdowns that Putin and his captive media would be free to spin however they wish. In my opinion, if Ukraine is to survive and thrive as an independent and democratic state, it must not be either side's outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. Instead of joining NATO, Ukraine should follow the example of Finland, an independent democratic country bordering Russia that cooperates with the West in many fields, but avoids carefully institutional hostility toward Russia. So sit tight, read reports from many sources, factor in the history, and keep in mind that propaganda almost always comes from both sides. The Russians are not entirely on the wrong side of this one. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Please share this message widely.